and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed, kindly subscribe to this channel. So this is the second video in the series where we want to configure a AWS ALB and secure that AWS ALB using a OpenID Connect provider. In this video, we are going to see how to secure that AWS ALB using Cognito. So in case you have not watched the previous video, which is the lesson 1, which is basically configuring a AWS ALB using a HTTPS listener, kindly go through that video, complete that configuration, and then you can come back to this video to secure that ALB using Cognito. But just to give a recap, what I did in the previous video was create a AWS ALB. So if you go to the EC2 load balancers, so you will see that AWS ALB that I created in the previous video, and this AWS ALB points to a listener, which in turn points to a target group, and that target group actually points to a Lambda function. So if you go to this target group, it actually points to a Lambda function, which returns a HTTP response, and that's what we saw in the previous video. And the HTTP response is, you can see it here. So this is the JSON response section that comes back in the HTTP response. And so in this video, we are going to see how to secure this URL using OpenID Connect. So basically, if you look at this URL right now, anyone can access this URL. It's a public internet facing URL. Anyone can go to this HTTPS, this OIDC ALB DNS, and they can access this URL, and there is no authentication logic present. Let's see how to introduce an authentication layer to this ALB without making any major code changes, so that only authenticated users can view this URL. So in order to do that, we are going to use Cognito, and the first step is to create a Cognito configuration for this AWS ALB. So let's go to the Cognito service, and we can close these tabs. Go to manage user pools and create a new user pool. Let's call it as AWS ALB Cognito. You can give any name. So just do a review defaults and create the pool. So the Cognito user pool is created. The next step is to create a domain name for this Cognito user pool, because this is the URL which will be used for redirecting the users to Cognito for authentication. And this domain name will be used for redirecting to Cognito. Of course, you can use your own domain. If you look at this option, you can use your own domain, but this is just a demo, so I'm just going to give a random domain name. I will use the same user pool name, but please note that this is globally unique. So if it is already used by someone else, it won't be available. But looks like it's not available. So I will just add a number, append a number to it. This is also not available. Let's see, 99. That is also not available. Just a random. Oh, this is surprising. OIDC ALB Cognito 991. Looks like it's not somehow allowing the same name. Let's try a different name. OIDC ALB test 22. Yeah, this domain is available. So save the changes. So we have the domain configured. Now we have to configure a client for that AWS ALB. When I say client, basically when you access this URL in Mozilla, this is the URL of the client application. So right now this URL points to a Lambda function which returns a static response, but in reality it will be the URL of some application which you built. So this is the client of that Cognito user pool. So in order to configure this client in the Cognito user pool, you need to create a app client. In Cognito world, they call it as app client, which is basically a OIDC client. So let's create that client, and I will name it as OIDC ALB client. You can leave these things as the default and create the app client. So we have the app client, the client secret, all those details configured here. And the next step is we need to actually do one more additional step, but I will actually show that at a later point of time. Now let's go back to the EC2 ALB console. Let's open a new tab and keep this Cognito tab active and go to EC2, and again back to the load balancers, and then the one which we created, OIDC ALB, and go to the listeners tab and go to view or edit rules. So right now if you look at this rule, any user who tries to access this URL in the HTTPS port will get forwarded to this target group, which is in turn points to your Lambda function. So I'm going to modify this rule and add a new action to this called authenticate. So what happens is, now the first step is, whenever anyone tries to access this URL using HTTPS, the first step that this rule will do is check if the user is already authenticated using a Cognito identity provider. If not, it will redirect the user to that Cognito login page. So the good thing is AWS ALB and AWS Cognito both belongs to AWS, so it has pretty good integration between both these services. But if you are using your custom identity provider like Okta or Azure AD or any other identity provider, you have the generic option called OIDC, which we can see in a different video. But right now, since we are using AWS Cognito, just select Amazon Cognito as the provider, and here you can see that user pool that you created in the previous step. So if you look at this value, right, US East 1 PJT something, if you go back to this general settings, it matches with this. So this is the pool ID, and that's what you see in this drop down. So select that, and the app client that you created in the previous step. So if you remember, if you go back to this Cognito screen, the app client 3M41, you see that same app client here. Select that. You can leave these remaining options as is and then save it. Okay, it says OAuth flows must be enabled in the user pool client. So if you go back to this app client settings, you need to actually do a couple of things. So first, enable this Cognito user pool, which means any users who are registered in this Cognito user pool can access this client application. And also enable this authorization code grant. And then you can have this these things enabled like email, OpenID, profile. And I think this should be enough. So click Save Changes. Okay, it says callback URLs cannot be empty. Right now, just add a dummy callback URL. We can remove this at a later point of time, and I will let you know what needs to be done. So as of now, just add a dummy. Okay, it says HTTPS. Okay. So it accepts only HTTPS. So add a dummy HTTPS callback URL for now, and go back to this step and click update. So good. So what we have done here is we have configured that Cognito. The scope is just OpenID. Actually, let's make one additional change. So let's actually add OpenID, profile, and email. So let's add all these three scopes. Select and update. So now this particular AWS ALB is protected using this Cognito user pool. So if you look at this rule, if anyone tries to access this URL from now onwards, the first step is this ALB will check if the user already has a Cognito session, and how it does that is using this session cookie, which it shows here. And if the session doesn't exist, it should redirect the user to the Cognito user pools login page. So let's test that. Let's go back to that Mozilla window. I will just refresh this URL. Boom. So it worked. So it basically redirected to the Cognito login page, but then we got a redirect mismatch error, which basically means this we have not yet configured that redirect URL in that Cognito client app client settings. So if you remember, I just added a dummy URL called example.com/callback just for the configuration purpose. But let's go and fix that issue. So if you go back to this app client settings screen, I added a dummy callback URL, but what we need to do is we need to add the actual AWS ALB's callback URL. So go to the AWS documentation and search for AWS ALB OIDC. The very first link, you will see authenticate users using an application load balancers. Select that link. And if you go to this particular section, prepare to use an OIDC compliant IDP, here it clearly says allow one of the following redirect URLs in your IDP app, whichever your users will use. So in this case, let's actually create this URL in that using our DNS. So if you go back to our AWS ALB, go to description, copy the DNS name, remove this dummy URL and add https:// the AWS ALB's DNS and the remaining part of the URL, which is /OAuth2/IDP response. So now it's done. Save the changes. So now the changes are saved. So ideally now what should happen is when I again try to hit this URL, it should redirect me to AWS Cognito, but then show the login page. Let's see if it works. Great. So now it shows the login page because we fixed that issue, the redirect URI issue. So if you look at this URL, right, the redirect URI parameter in the authorization code grant request that is sent to Cognito, you will see that exact same callback URL that I configured in the previous step. So that's what we fixed in the previous step. Now let's create some test users. Right now we don't have any users in this Cognito user pool. If you go back to this user pool screen, go to users, let's create a test user. Test user 1. We don't want to send an invitation. This is again just a demo. So let's create a password. We don't really need a phone number, but let's just add it. Test user 1 at example.com. Let's leave it as mark as verified. Okay, it's not allowing me this. Let's remove it anyway. It's an optional field. So if you go to this test user 1, so you see this user details here, like the user's email and all those details. So you can you can actually go here and check all the user details. And let's now try to log in using this username. So if I go to test user 1, let me use that same test user 1 and the password that I created. So first time it will ask for a new password. You can give any random password, whatever you are comfortable with. So now click send. So now we are logged in. So that is really great. So if you look at the headers here, you see some additional headers. If you look at the headers, you see some additional headers here, which is the OIDC access token, the OIDC data, and the OIDC identity. So let's check this OIDC access token and see what it is. And this is the JWT.io, which is a pretty good website to check these type of tokens. Looks like the copying didn't work. So let me go to the raw data and copy it. That is much easier. So if you look at this access token, so you have this subject, you have the client ID, which exactly matches with, if you, the Cognito client ID, you can check the Cognito client ID if you go back here. So this is the Cognito client ID. And then this is the domain name of that, not the domain, but this is the user pool ID, which we saw in the general settings. And then this is the username, test user 1. And what else you can see here? So that's all it has. So this is what this is the data it has in the access token. And let's check the ID token. So if you look at the ID token, so you have the username, the email address of that user, the subject of that user. So what is this subject basically? Let's copy this and I will show you what this subject is. So if you go to this users and then select this username, here you see a sub attribute. So what is this sub attribute? It's basically a unique identifier for that user that is assigned by the Cognito user pool. Whenever you create a new user profile, it will create a unique identifier for that user. So across the Cognito user pool, this will be the unique identifier for that user. So you can write your own logic to basically build, like have different rules for different users and use this unique identifier as for that user in the authorization table. So you can build your own logic. So let's do one additional step here. But before going there, if you carefully look at all these, this one, there is one additional header as well, which is called as X Amazon OIDC identity, which again matches with that same subject value which we saw here. So exactly matches with this. So these are the 3 additional headers that will be forwarded to that Lambda function when a user is authenticated. Let's actually clear the cookies in this Mozilla browser and again try to access that URL. You should again see the login page. So I have a plugin for that. If you want, you can also install it. It's a really nice plugin where you can easily clear the cookies. So I regularly use these plugins like SAML Tracer, this cookie managers, all those things. So now I clear the cookies. So if I try to access this, again it goes to the Cognito login page because the cookies are cleared. The session token is the session cookie is not available. So AWS ALB checks the cookie. Since it is not there, it just redirects to the login page. Now let me create a group. So let's create a group. These are just additional test group 1, test group 1. You can give some random role which you already have, or you can create a role and give. Anyway, it doesn't matter for now. So let's create these groups. Let's create one more group, test group 2, test group 2, and some random role. Now let's add the user. So user is added, and similarly let's add the same user to the second group. So this user is now part of both the groups, and now let's create a new user called test user 2. We don't again want an invitation. Let's leave the phone number. And test user 2, let's just add that user to one of the groups, maybe the second group. So the first user, test user 1, is part of both the groups. Test user 2 is part of only the second group. So now this is done. Let's now log in using test user 1 again and see what happens. So again, access token, the ID data, which is basically like an ID token, everything is created for this user. Now if you look at this access token, you should see those group details in the access token. Let's check it. So if you look at here, you are seeing all these groups this particular user is member of. So if you are writing any authorization logic in the Lambda function, so if something like, for example, if that lambda function has some business logic where it calls some other APIs, you can use these group memberships to authorize access to that particular user, like allow or deny certain functionalities based on the group membership for that user. So this is test user 1, who is part of both the groups. Now let's again clear the cookies and log in using test user 2 and see what happens. So I cleared all the cookies, it should redirect me, and now I'm logging in using test user 2. Since this is the first time I'm logging in, it's asking for new password, and so the login is again successful. Now let's copy this access token, which is basically a JWT, and see what is the difference. So now this user is only part of group 2. So that's what we configured when we created that user. And you have the test user 2, and if you look at the subject value, which is the Amazon OIDC identity, if you look at this value, it should match with the subject value of test user 2. And if I search for that value, yes, it exactly matches. So if you have followed both the videos, the previous one where I configured AWS ALB using a HTTPS listener, and the new video where I was easily able to secure the application which sits behind that ALB using a OpenID Connect provider without making any major changes. Like, it's straightforward, right? I just wrote a Lambda function. I didn't have to write any logic to redirect the user to a OpenID Connect provider, then build all that logic to get these tokens, all those things. Everything is done by Amazon's AWS ALB. So that is the greatest thing about this particular feature. And it might not work for all the use cases, but it's a very good feature that should work for many of the use cases if your applications are hosted in AWS. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching this video. Again, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.